that comes up time and time again with my contributors is that China tends to under-promise and over-deliver. What's your take on that?
Yes, this is historically true. And of course, the Chinese delegation here has been basically pointing to other countries, including implicitly the US, and saying, but you overpromise and underdeliver, so we're more reliable. And of course, from the perspective of the outside world, the US is unreliable on this issue. They did some good things under Barack Obama.
And then they ripped it all up.
Yeah, exactly.
Under Donald Trump.
And of course, if you're in the States, you say, well, this is just our domestic politics. But if it's outside, how do you deal with a country that does this when you're talking about, multi-year, multi-decadal commitments? Plus, the odd thing about the American political system is that the president can't speak for the government because, in the UK or France or whatever, they do, but not in the US because often they have to go back and go through Congress and get funding. And this has really scuppered things since the Kyoto summit, where Al Gore came away, yes, we're going to do this, and the Senate immediately said, no, we're not.
Do you think we could see any further advances from the US before the end of this conference?
Yes, this is really interesting. So this statement, on one level, it's just saying we are the two big countries and we're working together on this issue, so, deal with us seriously. On another level, it's a bit of a face-saving initiative, because both of them have been called out. China for sort of lack of engagement and lack of ambition on emissions cutting and not really believing in the 1.5 Celsius global warming guardrail. The US most dramatically on finance, where it's paying, by some estimates, about 1/8 of what its fair share should be on climate finance, and neither of them shows any signs of budging. So in a certain way, this could be a face-saving declaration that they've put out. But are they indicating that this is their level of ambition that they want to see out of the deal here? If they are, that's pretty bad news for the climate and bad news for the poorer developing countries that both of them claim to be friends of. If, on the other hand, they are planning to use this as just a foundation and press for other good things here, then it could be quite a constructive move. We wait and see on that one.
Some texts came out overnight. Alok Sharma, the president of COP26, also tweeted these pictures, which we're going to show you now on the screen this morning. You can see there, look, they're all hard at work. This is what we're talking about. We're talking about there's no negotiations going on behind closed doors there. He tweeted, following yesterday's plenary, I continued engagement with negotiating groups and parties on the cover decisions and the rule book. Several new draft texts were published this morning. I will hold another plenary at 11:15. Now, those texts that we've been looking at this morning, they're quite technical. Just talk us through what they tell us.
Very, very technical, and there are still areas where there's big disagreement, and actually where ministers in the end are going to have to get involved rather than negotiators, and sometimes where they're going to have to go back to their national capitals. So there's a few things to look at. One is called transparency. Basically, the point of transparency is that governments should have clarity on what each of them is doing. Now, you've got some governments that don't particularly want to show that clarity, and then you've got also a developing country, the bloc, that says we shouldn't be held to the same standards as the developed countries because we're less developed. Then you've got this thing.
Can I just butt in there? So a lot of this, and one of the big things that needed to come out to be sorted after Paris, was effectively a harmonisation of standards, wasn't it?
Exactly.
So you're going to cut emissions by 2060, you're going to do it by 2050, you're doing greenhouse gases, you're doing carbon-related emissions. It's about knowing whether we're looking at apples or oranges, isn't it?
Completely correct. And also it's about showing that when you make a pledge, you're actually serious about it. So if we go back to last week, we had all these pledges come out. We're going to get out of coal, we're going to protect our forests, we're going to cut methane emissions. Fine, but those are just words. In order to gain confidence that it's actually happening, governments need to be able to look at what each other is actually doing. So that's what transparency is about, really.
What do you think we might see today?
Really hard to say. I've been asking the very basic question with these cover texts, the overarching agreements, when are we going to get the next iteration of those? And we haven't got any clarity on that. The line comes, sometime today. I mean, there's negotiating behind the scenes. There will be capital-to-capital calls that are going on with different countries, different blocs that have very different positions. The one thing I think that is positive is that everybody seems to want to tie up these loose ends of the Paris rule book, the standards that you were mentioning there. So on transparency, on the carbon trading between different countries, how does that work? How is it regulated? And frankly, the fact that they haven't been tied up in previous years has just slowed everything else down. So if they really can get that done, that by itself will be a positive step.
I want to introduce a little bit of levity to the conversation to talk about some of the soft power tools that are being used.
Yes.
Apparently, Russia is so keen to get everything sewn up by Friday that they're offering everybody vodka shots if it gets done. And similarly with Mexico, they're offering tequila.
Not bad, eh? Not bad. Would be an inducement to many delegations, and why not? But I suspect both of them will be very safe in those offers, because the chance of it ending, judging what happened in previous years, the chance of it ending at 6 p.m. on Friday, would be zero, I think.
But it's interesting, isn't it, though, that when it comes to the nitty-gritty of negotiations, that sometimes it's the very human aspects that are the things that we remember.
Oh, the human stuff is really important as well. I mean, if we go back to the US-China agreement, why could that agreement happen? Basically because Xi Jinping and his team and John Kerry and his team, I wouldn't say necessarily they became friends, but they had a lot of contact during those years under Barack Obama. There's a personal relationship here. I've seen this in these negotiations. I've seen it in other fora, for example, the International Whaling Commission, the Biodiversity Convention. Many of these things, it is the personal touch. And sometimes you need to know the personality of the particular leader, what they actually like, what will sway them in order to get over that final line.
The other interesting thing, the other sort of X factor, isn't it, is sometimes how charismatic and persuasive a particular national leader is on a global stage. And I thought we heard a very powerful speech in the opening ceremony from the Barbadian Prime Minister, for example.
Yes, absolutely true. It was very compelling, and it was also contained one really interesting idea, which can't be taken forward here, but I hope is taken forward outside the UN Climate Convention, which is basically, we talk a lot about this $100 billion a year, but the actual amount that developing countries need in order to properly green their economies is far greater than that. So she was talking about basically a kind of quantitative easing, to use that phrase, for the climate on a global basis, sort of $500 billion a year. I mean,
she said we've spent, what was it, 25 trillion on quantitative easing because of the mess that our Western economies have got into. We've spent 9 trillion on COVID. Is there a more pressing concern than the climate?
Exactly. So it's a fascinating idea. I'm not an economist. I don't know whether it can work. I've asked a few friends who are economists, and I usually get back a very heavily caveated and nuanced answer. But it really ought to be taken forward, because, the reality is in many of the poorer countries, if you want to borrow money as the government or as a company, for example, to build a wind farm, the interest rates you have to pay on that are exorbitant currently, often because of that country's debt situation. Now, that's a real barrier to decarbonisation in many of the poorer countries. So there has to be a solution, basically.
Final question before we go back to the proceedings which are currently underway today. The final text that we get out of all of this, do you think there's any chance we could see some strengthened wording around that 1.5 degrees? I kept asking yesterday, I was interviewing the Deputy Energy Secretary from the United States, and he just didn't engage with it. But it's controversial, but it seems to me that that is what certainly some of the island nations are saying. If we don't make this a commitment rather than a goal, then some parts of the world are doomed.
I don't think it will be made a commitment, because that will imply that every country has to make a big and very rapid transition, and really, among other things, coming off fossil fuels over the next 2 or 3 decades. So I think it will be pushed back on those grounds by the countries that you would expect to push back on it, headed by Saudi Arabia and so on. I was also slightly... when I was reading this US-China thing, I was thinking, hang on, this isn't really prioritising 1.5. This is going back to the Paris Agreement language of well below 2 and aiming for 1.5.
Yes, I noticed that as well.
Yeah, so this really has been China's position all along. If the US is falling into line with that, then I think that reduces any chance of having 1.5 prioritised in the final agreement here.
All right, well, we won't know until we get that final agreement. Let's take you back now to those proceedings which are still underway, all about what is taking place in cities